we're in Daniel 7, and now we're getting into the prophetic portion of the book, okay? So up to this point, the first 6 chapters have been pretty much narrative, with the exception of Daniel chapter 2 with Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the golden, or of the guy with the gold head, and we remember talking about that. So we'll talk, and we're going to incorporate that a little bit in tonight, because after Daniel chapter 7, and this is why we're not going to go any further, the original language goes back to Hebrew. So remember, what my contention is that the Hebrew portions are specifically meant for the Jewish people first, and then us, whereas the portions originally written in Aramaic, of which chapter 7 is tonight, are specifically meant for Gentiles first, with Jews tied in. And you'll see that, especially as we read about this tonight, because this gets into the deep prophetic weeds, okay? And what's really neat about this is what you're going to see over the next few weeks is that a lot of the stuff that Daniel predicted has already taken place, okay? But there are some things that are really, really powerful that haven't taken place yet. And wait till we get to Daniel chapter 9, because what's really crazy is that in Daniel chapter 9, there are specifically 4 verses that not only predicted the coming of Jesus, but predicted his triumphal entry to the day. And that's where you're just like, whoa. Okay, and which is why, by the way, when Jesus crests I think I've talked to you about how the Mount of Olives drops down, and then it flattens out, and then it crests up again, and then it drops into the Kidron Valley. In Luke, it talks about how he wept over Israel. In the Greek there, he was just broken. And he talks about, you knew this was coming. If only you would have paid attention. And he's talking about Daniel, because that was when he was coming down in the triumphal entry. So it's predicted to the day. They knew exactly, if they had been paying attention, and they just didn't want him to be the one, because he wasn't promoting what they wanted. So what we'll look at starting tonight is some pretty incredible stuff with regards to prophecy and how it's already been completed. Now, one of the things that you have to understand, and this gets back to the train track analogy, remember? There's two agendas here going on. One, I believe, one for the Jews, one for the Gentiles. They're both divine plans that God has for his chosen people and for the rest of us, but only one train, and that's God's divine plan. Now, one of the things that you have to understand about how I interpret prophetic literature, this becomes very important. I don't do it allegorically. I'll translate it literally. That doesn't mean there's not symbolism, okay? There is tons of symbolism in the prophetic literature. But when Daniel sees what he sees, these 4 beasts that we're going to read about tonight, that's exactly what he's seeing. He's not seeing like a helicopter or, something that he wasn't familiar with. What he's describing in his vision is what he sees. Now, what it symbolically means, however, is something else. Does that make sense? And we know that because when the angel comes, and tonight the angel's only mentioned as one that is with, who is standing there next to what Daniel sees. I believe it's Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, because his name is mentioned in the next few chapters as being the guy. So I think it's the same person. It's not specifically stated. But when the angels start describing what Daniel is seeing, because he doesn't understand what he's seeing, they're describing it from a symbolic standpoint. Does that make sense? So what he sees is what he sees, right? But symbolically, what they mean, the angel will describe. And that's, I believe, how we have to go about translating this. Now, one other thing that's really important to note here. Up to this point, Daniel has been able to interpret dreams and visions, right? He's known what they've meant, right? He knew what the handwriting on the wall was writing. He understood what was going on. From this point forward, he doesn't have a clue what he's seeing, and he needs help. That points to the prophetic nature of this, because he's like, I don't understand this. And then the angel Gabriel comes along and tells him what's going on. So there's a shift here. And remember what we said. The book of Daniel, it starts with little things. Things as small as just dietary rules, right? In chapter 1, to being faithful in the bigger things. So Daniel and his compadres have been faithful in the smaller things, first 6 chapters, and now Daniel's going to be entrusted with some pretty amazing information. Does that make sense? So what we'll do is we'll dive in here with the first verse. Daniel chapter 7, verse 1, because it tells us a lot. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Okay, so this is really important. First year of Belshazzar. Remember, Belshazzar was mentioned all the way back in Daniel 5, handwriting on the wall. Remember, for years, people didn't think he even existed till they found all this archaeological material which named him. Come to find out, he was the son of King Nabonidus. Okay? So, what this tells us, the first year of Belshazzar, is that this happened in 553 BC. Okay? Now remember, that means that the events of chapters 6 and 5 happened after what Daniel saw here. Now, why do I tell you that? Why is this important? Because I think that Daniel being told what the dreams meant, in Daniel chapter 7 and in Daniel chapter 8, which we'll find out next week, happened in 551 BC. That's why he could interpret the handwriting on the wall. He doesn't understand what he's seeing in his dreams, so he asked the angel to interpret it for him. And in 553 BC, the angel interprets these visions, and there's 3 of them. 1 dream, 3 visions. And in Daniel chapter 8, happened in 551 BC, the angel interprets those visions. Daniel, that's why Daniel knew what Belshazzar was seeing on the handwriting on the wall and why he could interpret it, because he knew that day was coming, which was 539 BC. I can't remember the exact date. I think October 12th or something. You've got it on one of your handouts. Does that make sense? So Daniel knew what was going to happen because of chapters 7 and 8. He knew what was going to happen in Daniel chapter 5. All right? That's the first thing. So this would have been 553 BC, and Babylonian history tells us that's the year that Nabonidus went to Tema. And remember, we said that there's an oasis in Tema. It's called the Oasis of Tema. Okay? So, it says this, he saw a dream, that's singular, and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Okay, so we're going to find out that it's 1 dream, but it's 3 visions. The first vision is chapter 7, verse 1 to 8. The second vision is chapter 7, verse 9 to 12. And the third vision is chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. But we'll break them down as we go through it. So 1 dream, 3 visions. Now, what else is key is this. At the end of chapter 7, verse 1, Daniel wrote down what he saw. But it was a summary, meaning it wasn't everything that he saw, just the bullet points, if you will. Okay? That's important, because if we believe that the scriptures are divinely inspired and that they're the word of God and without error, then what we're reading here in the English tonight is basically what Daniel wrote down. Okay? All right, so look at verses 2 through 6. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. Okay, this is really, really important, because here's where the symbolism begins. The word for wind in the Hebrew is ruach. It's in English, it would be spelled R-U-W-A-C-H. Ruach, okay? R-U-W-A-C-H. Spirit is also a translation for ruach. So wind and spirit are the same thing. In the Greek, in the New Testament, the exact same thing is done. Pneuma is spirit, but it also means wind. Okay? Now, this is a total sidetrack, but I want you to think about this for a minute, because I think that we as Westerners have become really, really callous and we kind of blow off the spiritual warfare and the sacred, right? The mysterious things that we Westerners have to have an explanation for everything. We have to have, allegedly people want to believe the science, except when it comes to certain things. But at any rate, there has to be science, there has to be an explanation. We're Westerners, right? And I think I talked about this in one of my classes a couple years ago, whereas if a Hebrew or an Easterner eats something that is really, really good, they acknowledge how good it is and they, praise the person who made it. A Westerner will eat something really, really good, and what's the first thing they want to know? What's in it, right? What is in this? Or what's the recipe? Will you give me the recipe? Right? So this is a Near Easterner mindset here, but a Westerner, we don't think this way, and I think we miss out when we don't, because what you'll see here is I think there is some spiritual warfare going on behind the scenes. So think about it. Ruach can mean spirit or it can mean wind. Pneuma can mean spirit or wind in the Greek. But if you think about it, and this is the connection that I want to make. Anytime that we read about Jesus being on the Sea of Galilee, what usually is going on? Storm or the wind, right? And usually he tells it to shut up. And the word that is used, especially in the Gospel of Mark, the word that is used for rebuking the sea and the wind is the exact same word that Jesus uses, or that Mark uses, for when Jesus tells a demon to come out of a person. Satan has been called the prince of the power of the air. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes, like a gentle breeze, that's one thing. But wind can be disconcerting for me. And it can be unsettling. You know what I mean? And so I think that what we see oftentimes is when wind is talked about, and because wind can translate because ruach can translate as spirit and wind, and the same in the Greek, I think that there are some spiritual warfare connotations going on here. Okay? Now what's neat about this is that it says that they are the four winds of heaven. So I think that what we're seeing here is we're seeing that God's sovereignty, the Holy Spirit is working here. All right, my plan is going to start to come into play. Okay? Just keep that, in mind for when you see words like wind and spirit in the Old Testament or wind and spirit in the New Testament. They're interchangeable. They are interchangeable. So the wind, if Jesus is rebuking a storm to shut it up, it probably has some demonic activity in it. And usually that's because Jesus told the disciples, hey, I'm going to go sleep in the back of the boat, and we're going to the other side. And if he said they're going to the other side, they're going to the other side, right? So that Satan and the enemy is not going to stop him. Okay? So keep that in mind, because this is where this stuff starts to really, really get interesting and heavy, because I think there are things going on that we don't see that are constantly going on, which you'll find out later on in the book of Daniel, when Daniel's trying to figure out what's going on with something, and he has to, it's in Daniel chapter 10, and Gabriel says, I was trying to get to you to talk to me, or to tell you what was going on, but I was stopped by the prince of Persia. And we're going to talk about who that is and all that when we get to chapter 10. And he had to have the archangel Michael help him out to get to Daniel. So there is a warfare going on behind the scenes that we're not privy to. And I think that's something to keep in mind, especially with the recent events of the past week and a half. And I think you would agree. There's always a spiritual war going on. We have to be diligent to be ready to fight. Okay? So first thing is that, the wind, the four winds of heaven. We're probably dealing with the Holy Spirit there, because it says they came out of heaven. And they were stirring up the great sea. Now, The Great Sea, if it's literal in the scriptures, it's the Mediterranean. Okay? Numbers chapter 34, verses 6 and 7 says this. Oops, went right past it. Numbers chapter 34, verses 6 and 7 say this. As for the western border, God is telling Moses what the border of the land of promise is going to be. As for the western border, you shall have the Great Sea, that is, its coastline. This shall be your west border, and this shall be your north border. You shall draw your borderline from the Great Sea to Mount Hor. Okay, and on it goes. If you go to Joshua chapter 1, verse 4, this is what God says to Joshua. From the wilderness in this Lebanon, even as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and as far as the Great Sea, Mediterranean, toward the setting of the sun will be your territory. That's interesting, by the way, because that includes all of Iran and Iraq and a bunch of Afghanistan and all the areas that are not Israel today. They talk about that little chunk of land that's about the size of, a little bigger than Yellowstone County. That's the promised land. Yeah, it is, but it's way bigger than that. Okay? Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, all those countries are engulfed in what God has promised his people, which we're grafted into. Okay? So, if the Great Sea is being talked about literally here, it would be the Mediterranean. But because Daniel isn't anywhere near the Mediterranean, now it is a dream and a vision, okay? And because what we're going to see in his vision are these four beasts, and the beasts are coming up out of the sea, I believe that the Great Sea is symbolic here, okay? So, in order to understand how the Jews viewed the sea, we have to talk about what's going on here, because this will help you make sense of the four beasts, okay? Now, when we talk about the sea, we're not talking about the Sea of Galilee. It's fresh water. It's a lake. It isn't even bigger. Flathead Lake is bigger. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. But they're talking about saltwater bodies. But in the Bible, when the sea is talked about symbolically, it's viewed this way. The Jews viewed the sea as an obstacle. Well, we got the Red Sea down here. What did they have to cross before God parted the waters? The Red Sea. So it was viewed by them as an obstacle. The sea was also viewed as chaotic and evil. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Everything is chaotic. We'll just go to Genesis 1, verse 2 and read it, and you can see, rather than paraphrase it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, meaning the water, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface, or hovering over the surface of the waters. So that's void, it's dark, it's chaotic, it's evil. Okay? That verse, by the way, some scholars believe that that's when the fall occurred, and was what created all the chaos, because God is not a God of chaos, but that's a different subject for a different day. So they view it as an obstacle. They view it as chaotic and evil. They view it as, symbolically, as a place of death. It isn't by accident that this is called the what? The Dead Sea. Nothing lives in that sucker. In fact, you can float on it. It's so salty. It's great for your skin, by the way. My skin, it hurt. I exfoliated all right, but boy, oh boy, was it painful. I didn't realize how messed up my skin was until I walked in that water, and I'm like, oh my gosh, right? But anyway, they view it as a place of death. They also view the sea as judgment. When God destroyed the entire planet, the one time he did it, how did he do it? With water. And remember, the vast majority of the water that God used to cover the planet didn't come from the sky, because that's fresh water. It came from what? The ground and the sea, right? Jonathan Sarfati he's a theologian, but he's also a scientist, and he's an expert in that. He said there is enough water on this planet to cover the entire planet right now. thanks to the Mariana Trench, it's like several thousand feet deeper than Everest is tall. So he said that if all were, there's enough water on the planet right now to cover the entire planet again. Okay? And much of the flood came up from the ground. And this is where it's so cool what Sarfati talks about with those tectonic plates. Like if they shift, it would open up the ground and water would just come blasting up. Okay? So they also the Jews viewed the sea as judgment. They also viewed the sea, and here's where we get to the rubber meeting the road. They viewed the sea as Gentiles. It was a symbol of the Gentiles. If you go to Exodus chapter 23, verse 31, it says this: I will fix your boundary from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, Mediterranean, and from the wilderness to the river Euphrates, for I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you will drive them out before you. When God issued the decree that the promised land would be theirs, he stated that the sea was the Sea of the Philistines, which were the lifelong enemies of the Jews. So for the Jews then, symbolically, the sea became a symbol of the Gentiles. And that's what I'm interpreting it as tonight. Got to save it to the end because it's being recorded. Okay? But write it down. I don't want to miss it. Okay? All right, so just as a review, the Great Sea could be viewed as evil and chaotic. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. It could be viewed as an obstacle, the Red Sea crossing. It could be viewed as death, the Dead Sea itself. It could be viewed as judgment, the flood and Noah. And it could be viewed as representative or symbolic of the Gentiles. And that's what I'm going to say it is today. So, look at verses 2 through 6, or 3 through 6. 4 great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was also given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I kept, my bad. So I went too far. Those 4 verses describe the first 3 beasts. Now, we're going to find out later, spoiler alert, in verses 15 to the end of the chapter, who those beasts represent, okay? Beast number 1, the lion with the wings of an eagle, is Babylon. Okay, we'll talk about that. That's verse 4. Beast number 2 in chapter 7, verse 5 is Medo-Persia, the Persian Empire. And beast number 3 in verse 6 is Greece. Okay? So Babylon, Persia, Greece. Now keep that in mind, because what you're going to see is, based on when this vision happened, Daniel knew who these empires were. These weren't the ones that he was really worried about. It's the 4th one, but I'll get into that in just a minute. Okay? Now, if indeed the Great Sea is symbolic of the Gentiles, then all of these 3 empires would make sense, because each one of them was a Gentile empire: the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, and the Greeks. Track it with me so far? But here's what else makes it really interesting. Each one of these beasts is a hybrid animal. Okay? Now, remember what we talked about. And again, this is why the first 6 chapters set you up for these chapters. Remember what we talked about. The only way that Rakshak and Benny and Daniel could make sure that they were not defiling themselves by violating Levitical dietary laws was if they just ate vegetables. Remember? We talked about that? Okay. Levitical dietary laws, most of them prohibit the mixing of foods. This is why a cheeseburger is not kosher, right? Or pizza, like a Supreme. The Jews would have a meltdown with a Supreme pizza. Like, no, you can't mix foods. You just don't mix foods. And that goes back to the Levitical dietary laws, okay? Having said that, The Jews then, from a spiritual standpoint, viewed prophecy like this, and this isn't just in Daniel, this is any prophetic book, where beasts that are seen that have multiple different kinds of characteristics from different animals, that represents evil, that represents chaos, because God is a God of order. It represents idolatry. Many of the ancient gods, well, when we talk about Babylon being the first beast, when they uncovered the city of Babylon, its symbol was a lion with eagle's wings. And see, the Jews viewed that as idolatrous. They viewed it as a violation of the first two commandments. Why? Because God is a God of order. You don't see dogs and cats procreating. We don't see different species. Now, different dogs can procreate and make, a dog, but it's still a dog. Does that make sense? So we don't see that today. We don't see it ever. We don't see animals. An eagle doesn't procreate with a lion to make an eagle lion. So the Jews would have viewed this as idolatrous. Daniel would have recognized what it stood for. He had been living in Babylon for almost all of his life. Okay? And so he would have known that this represented Babylon. So it's really, really important when you see an idol in the Old Testament, or that's described as have multiple different characteristics of different animals, the Jews would have been mortified by this because they would have viewed it as chaos and disorder and a special kind of idolatrous evil. Are you tracking with me so far? It was really, really important to understand because God didn't mix things together. There weren't hybrids. And so again, this is another reason why I believe that the Great Sea is metaphorically or symbolically talking about the Gentiles. Okay, as to far as what it means, his wings were plucked and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a human mind also was given to it. Scholars don't agree on what that means. Some say it's a reference to Nebuchadnezzar when he lost his mind. Remember all the way back in Daniel, I think it was 3 or 4. Okay, so there are some that believe that there would have been 4. Daniel 4, so some people believe that that's a reference to that. Other people believe that because of what the next beast is like, it was just Babylon that was conquered and then incorporated into the Persian Empire. Because Babylon became the capital city of the Persians as well, and the Greeks. Okay? So not everyone is in agreement as to how chapter 4 or verse 4 of chapter 7 should be interpreted, but it probably could refer to both Nebuchadnezzar and the fact that Babylon was incorporated into the Persian Empire. So the second beast is verse 5, and it is, as we'll find out later from the angel, Persia. Resembling a bear, it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth, and thus they said to it, "Arise, devour much meat." Okay. As far as it's saying raised up on one side, I don't know if that's what your English version says, but basically it's a lopsided bear. Okay? So he's got one leg shorter than the other. Okay? That's literally how it translates in the Aramaic. He's lopsided. Now, the reason that makes sense is because even though it was called the Medo-Persian Empire, the Persians were the predominant people group in that empire. Okay? And when it talks about devouring 3 ribs, again, scholars are not necessarily in agreement here. Some say that the ribs were the 3 parts of the empire because one of the parts was Babylon, then Persia, then the Medes had their place. Okay? So there's some discussion. It really doesn't matter if you think about it because we do know that the second beast was the Persian Empire. And by the way, in 553 BC, Daniel would have been very aware of the Persians' rise. And when it says, "Arise, devour much meat," the Persian Empire was massive. It was, each empire kept getting bigger. The Assyrians had a big one. The Babylonians had a bigger one. Persian Empire was massive, and then along comes Alexander the Great, right? But the Persian Empire was massive because what they did was when they would conquer people, they'd say, hey, live the way you want to live, just pay your taxes and don't cause us problems. It's why all the Jews got to go home. Okay? So it was a massive empire, which would explain why the devouring of much meat. But Daniel would have been very, very aware of the Persians. And I'm telling you this because when we get to the fourth beast, this is where Daniel is confused. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Okay? Now, based on intertestamental history and based on what Daniel's interpreters, the angel's going to interpret the dream, we know that this is Greece. And here's why. Because when Alexander the Great was marching on the city of Jerusalem, I can't remember the date, it's in my notes somewhere, and I'll get it here in a second. Okay, here we go. When Alexander the Great was marching on the city of Jerusalem, and I don't have the day, the year, I'll get it later. The Jewish priesthood went out to meet him with the high priest. This might be in your pre-New Testament timeline. But the reason that they did this was because they had sided with the Persians. And they were terrified of what the Greeks were going to do. And the Persians, it made sense for them to side with the Persians. The Persians had let them go home. Esther was the queen of a Persian king. Nehemiah was the cupbearer of a Persian king. They had good relations. The other reason it made sense was because culturally they were the same. They were Near Easterners. They lived the same way. The Greeks were West, and the Westerners were nothing like them. Okay? So when Alexander's marching on Jerusalem, the priesthood, led by the high priest, goes out to meet him, and they told him that they expected him, that he would be coming. And they showed him this verse in Daniel. And some other verses as well. Dang it, I have to find this or it'll drive me crazy. It is on here? Okay, thank you. Yeah, okay, it's on your guys's, you saved me. It's on your post-exilic timeline on the very back. 332 BC. Alexander the Great marches to Jerusalem and is met outside the city by the high priest Jadis. Jadis shows Alexander chapters 7, 8, and 11 of the book of Daniel and said, we knew you were coming. We knew that you would be conquering. And Daniel, being the ever superstitious, person that he was, said, this is a good omen. And not only did he not burn the city of Jerusalem to the ground, but he also told the Jews throughout his empire they can worship as they want. Which is why then that the Jews kind of became incorporated into the Greek way of thinking. So by the time Jesus comes along, the vast majority of Jews didn't even speak Hebrew anymore, which is why they relied on the Pharisees and Sadducees to interpret the Old Testament, because Hebrew and Greek are way different languages. Okay? So from a historical standpoint, all of this starts to make sense with regards to the New Testament. You following me so far? Because Jesus, these high priests, or the Pharisees and Sadducees, are leading the people astray by saying, you can't read Hebrew, you're too influenced by the Greeks, and this is what the law says. Well, it's not what the law says. They were basing it on their traditions. You follow me so far? So we got all this going on. And so we know that the third beast is Greece. Also, if you look at verse 6, on its back 4 wings of a bird, and it also had 4 heads. When Alexander died in 323 BC, he didn't have a male heir. There are a variety of reasons for that, but we won't get into those today. He didn't have a male heir, so it ended up, there was some civil strife, and the empire ended up being divided up by 4 of his generals. So the 4 wings and the 4 heads represent 4 of the generals. The 2 that we'll need to be very familiar with are Seleucus and Ptolemy, because they will play a major role in Daniel chapter 11, as well as in Daniel chapter 8 and 9 when they talk about the abomination of desolation. Okay? So, I know that we're getting stuck here. Well, we're doing okay. Here's where Daniel gets fearful. And here's where Daniel doesn't understand Oh, is this on here too? Oh, excellent. Thank you. Here's where Daniel gets confused. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. If Alexander didn't take over till over 200 years later, how would have Daniel have known that the leopard was the Greeks? Well, the Greeks had been around since the 1500s BC. They had already been around for over 1,000 years. And their philosophy and their thought, they were very well known. And they weren't a unified empire. Alexander did that. But they were very well known, like Athens and Sparta, as city-states. Okay? So Daniel would have been very familiar with all of that as well. All that to say, the first three beasts, he would have recognized the symbolism of them. And he would have known what they stood for. Also, he would have known that they were Gentiles because God would have never created a beast that was a hybrid. But then, verses 7 and 8. And I want you to notice something interesting here. After this, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it, and behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. Daniel doesn't describe this beast other than one characteristic. It had iron teeth. But he's terrified of it because he says it's terrifying and dreadful and extremely strong. And he also talked about another characteristic besides the iron teeth, and that is the 10 horns. Out of these 10 came one with eyes and a mouth, and this horn was boasting. Okay? It can be translated as great things in Aramaic. So, Daniel doesn't know what this one is. And when we get the translation of it here, we're going to have to talk about it because I think that there's a reason why he doesn't describe it. It's easy from a symbolic standpoint to see Babylon as a lion with wings because when they uncovered Babylon, they found lions with wings, right? It's easy to see because the leopard also happened to be the symbol of Alexander's city-state, the Macedonians, right? So it is easy to see the symbolism of the first three. I don't think there's any symbolism for the fourth one because it isn't just an empire, it's a culture. And we'll get to that in just a second. But the first vision is over, okay? And that first vision is a vision of chaos and disorder and violence. Verse 7, the fourth beast devoured and crushed and trampled down what was left of the other 3 beasts, okay? Crushed them all. And by the way, that's exactly what Western culture has done on the planet, basically. Okay, but we'll get into that in just a minute. But then the next 2 visions occur. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, the books were opened, and then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted them for an appointed period of time. Now here's where this gets interesting. The Ancient of Days occurs only in this chapter of Daniel out of the entire Bible, and it occurs 3 times. The adjective ancient in the Aramaic is derived from an Aramaic and Hebrew verb which means to proceed, move, or advance. So, as an adjective, when it's connected to all of the grammar that we've talked about here, and by the way, the noun days, even though it's written in our English as singular, it literally translates as advanced the days. Okay? So according to the Aramaic grammar, listen to this. This is kind of cool. It is defined as this, quote, an elegant Semitic expression to designate an old man. Okay? So you don't call somebody old, you call them advanced of days, because it is let me read it again, an elegant Semitic expression to designate an old man. Today I felt like an advanced of days person, and it's probably because I'm getting that way, but anyway, okay? So, it is based on Daniel's description of the Ancient of Days. It's probably a euphemistic term for God, based on what Daniel says about the Ancient of Days, okay? Now, I'm going to make the case, and again, search the scriptures, see if these things are so, that the Ancient of Days is God the Father, because the Son of Man is the third vision in verses 13 and 14. And Jesus referred to himself in Matthew as the Son of Man all the time. Okay? So I'm going to make the case, and by the way, the Pharisees and Sadducees and religious leaders would have known exactly what he was referring to because they knew this book. Okay? Which is another reason they wanted to kill him. Now, if this is indeed God the Father, the first member of the Trinity, and I believe it is, then it portrays a stark contrast between the chaotic, evil, violent world of the Gentiles and the ordered, pure, holy, righteous world of the sovereign and infinite God. And what else it shows is that God is more powerful because he is sovereign than the four beasts. I do want to point out one other term used here because of its messianic connotations, and that is the term Son of Man. So let's read verses 13 and 14. I kept looking in the night visions, this is the third vision, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a Son of Man was coming. What did Jesus say? How was he going to come back? In the clouds. Okay? He told his disciples that. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and the kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Okay. Now, we have to talk about the phrase Son of Man, because it isn't always messianic in nature. Every time it's used in the New Testament, 94 times it's used in the New Testament, it is meant to mean Jesus. Okay? 89 of those 94 times, Jesus actually refers to himself as the Son of Man. So he made it very, very plain that he was the Messiah, which is why they killed him. Okay? So 94 times in the New Testament, Son of Man is used, the phrase. And it's always meant to refer to Jesus. He refers to himself as Son of Man 89 times. The other 5 times, it's a couple times in John. I think one in Acts. I can't remember the other ones. But it also means Jesus, okay? However, in the Old Testament, it isn't always messianic like it is here. In the Old Testament, the phrase Son of Man could symbolize humanity itself. Psalm chapter 8, verse 4. It could be referring to a prophet. Ezekiel was called the Son of Man by God 93 times in the book of Ezekiel. Okay? But it also was used to refer to Israel, the sons of men, or the Son of Man as a symbol of Israel. But it also was used to talk about our depravity. The Son of Man is who the Son of Man is. That's why we needed the real Son of Man to come. Okay? But here we know, based on verse 14, that this is talking about the Messiah here. And by the way, the Pharisees and Sadducees would have known this as well, which is another reason again why they wanted to kill Jesus. But verse 14 says this about the Messiah. To him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. Now, I'm going to pause right there halfway through verse 14. I believe that that phrase right there, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him, is a direct phrase all the way back to the third part of the Abrahamic covenant. If you go to the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, it says this. Verse 3 says this, I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Okay? All the families. There are Christians from every ethnicity, every nation on the planet today, and every nation that has ever existed. And that is exactly what he predicted in the Abrahamic covenant. Now, the word for everlasting in the next phrase, his dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away. This is a really important word to understand in the Aramaic. It's a'alam. It would be spelled A-A-L-A-M. Okay? Now, we translate it as everlasting, but it literally translates this way: the future or past indefinitely. Now, that's really, really important from a messianic standpoint, and here's why. For a devout Jew, they do not believe the Messiah is God. That's why they deny Christ, because Christ made it very clear that he's God. Okay? So the Jews will say, no, the Messiah is not God. Well, we are talking about the Messiah here. And a'alam means the future or past indefinitely. Okay? And I would use both here. He's the future indefinitely, meaning the kingdom will last forever. And he's been in the past indefinitely because he's also God. Make sense? So that's a very, very important word when talking about what's going on here. Which will not pass away. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So we have one vision, super chaotic. Then we have one vision that is, or two visions that are talking about God and order and sovereignty. Okay? And I got to get caught up to my notes here. Okay, here we go. So verses 15 and 16. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. I approached one of those who were standing by, who he's seeing in his vision, and I'm making the case that it's Gabriel because that's who he talks to for the rest of the book, and he'll be identified by name, and began asking him the exact meaning of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Now remember, this is important because in Daniel chapters 2 and 4, he could interpret the dreams. He prayed about it, but he could interpret it. And in fact, in Daniel chapter 2, he told Nebuchadnezzar what he had dreamed. Remember? But now he's flying blind here. Okay? So he asks an angel, what's going on? Some things to note. Okay, we already talked about that. So Daniel is going to make known to him what's going on. Will you do me a favor, Mom? My kids keep calling. Will you figure out if there's something going on that I need to know about? Thanks. All right. And this phone is just blowing up. All right. Great. Just what we need, more craziness. Here is the one telling him what it means. Verse 17. These great beasts, which are four in number, are four kings who will arise from the earth. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. Then I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, and which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remainder with its feet. Okay, so what we have here is Daniel is like, all right, what's going on with these visions? But he doesn't want to know about the first three. I believe it's because he already knew what they were. He only wanted to know about the fourth one and what was happening. Now, the one that explained the vision to him said that the great beasts are kings who will rise from the earth. But the saints, the word there in the Aramaic is Kadishi, and it literally means the holy ones. And how it reads with the preposition in this phrase, because ours says saints of the highest one, it literally reads the holy ones of the highest one. Now, I believe, and again, search the scriptures to see if these things are so, that it literally means that it's the Jews. Okay. Was it something stupid? Oh, geez. So it was something stupid. And this is being recorded. Caleb, just ignore this. My kids kept blowing up my phone. And turns out my kids are being stupid. So, all right. Now, here is where there is going to be a difference of opinion interpretively here. Okay? There are some denominations that do not believe that Israel has a place anymore in God's divine plan, that the church has replaced it. Okay? There are some denominations that believe that the covenants no longer apply to Israel, but apply to everyone because Israel rejected Jesus. That's true, they did, but we've all gone astray, right? So, what I'm going to say here is based on how I interpret the saints of the highest one, which literally reads in Aramaic, the holy ones of the highest one. I'm promoting the idea that what the angel is saying here is that God is talking about, or is that Daniel is talking about God's chosen people. Now, why does that even make a lick of difference in the grand scheme of things? It makes a difference from a standpoint of how we interpret the book of Revelation. Okay? There are those that believe that the church will go through the great tribulation and all the horrible stuff in Revelation we'll experience. Some people believe it's already happening. I don't think so. There's not boulders coming out of the sky and things like that. But anyway, so they believe that we go through the tribulation. And then Christ comes back and everybody that's accepted him goes up into heaven and we sing Kumbaya and live happily ever after in heaven, right? However, I believe that the church is raptured before the tribulation. And that when you read Revelation, you see that the gospel is being preached during the tribulation. If I'm right, if I'm wrong, this doesn't change God's divine plan. It just means I interpret it wrong. If they're wrong, I was right. So that's important, right? So all that to be said, I do not believe that God has eliminated Israel from his plan. Once there is chosen people, there is chosen people. The book of Hosea says that God wants to get rid of them, but he can't give them up because they're his kids. There are plenty of times when I've been angry with my kids and wanted to disown my kids, like just now, but they're my kids. I'm stuck with them, right? And God made a covenant. If God goes back on his covenant, that means he lied, and that means he's not God. I just can't see that playing out that way. So I believe that what happens is the church is raptured. We don't go through the tribulation. And by the way, there's in the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus is telling his disciples, because they want to know what's going to happen, he doesn't tell them the when, he tells them the what. And he tells them, he talks about the 10 virgins. He doesn't talk about the bride. And we've talked before, those of you that have attended any of my classes, you know about a Jewish wedding. The bride goes back to the groom's house first. And then later he comes to get the bridal party. Okay? Well, that would make sense if he's using that parable of the 10 virgins as the parable for Israel. 5 virgins were ready, 5 weren't. I think what will happen is the church gets raptured. It's going to get blamed on as aliens. We know this. It's been set up this way. Really, it has. You know, Hollywood's been setting us up for all of this alien abduction stuff. So the enemy's not dumb. Okay? So it'll be aliens, but I think devout Jews, some of them will go, holy cow, those crazy Christians were right. And this Bible is exactly, they're interpreting it the right way. But because as we'll see later on in Daniel, because chapter 9 is tied to the book of Revelation, it's the Jews that are preaching the gospel during the tribulation, because Satan is trying to destroy them. Now, having said that, the other reason I believe that this is the case, besides the Olivet Discourse, is the reality that in the first 3 chapters, John talks about nothing but the church. In fact, he talks about 7 churches. Once Revelation 4 hits, John never talks about the church again until the new heaven and new earth in Revelation 21 and 22, but he does talk all about Israel. Okay? So, having said that, that's a really long way to come around back to verse 18, that I believe that the holy ones of the highest one, or the saints of the highest one, he is talking there about Jews. Now, there are some denominations, like I said, that will say, no, those are Christians. Okay, we'll see who's right and who's wrong when it all goes down and they can owe me in heaven. Okay. So then, but Daniel doesn't focus on this, which is again why I think Daniel thinks that they're Jews, because there were no Christians in Daniel's day, just believing Jews. But he wanted to know about the 4th beast. And notice how he adds another detail to the 4th beast. Claws of bronze, which devoured, crushed, and trampled. And he wanted to know, verse 20, the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and before which 3 of them fell, namely that horn which had eyes and mouth, uttering great boasts, and which was larger in appearance than its associates. I kept looking, and that horn, and I believe this is the tribulation, was waging war with the saints, could be the holy ones, the Jews, and overpowering them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one, the holy ones of the highest one, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. Thus he said, this is the angel, the 4th beast will be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which will be different. Now pay attention to this is really important. Which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will rise after them. He will be different from the previous ones and will subdue 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the highest one, and he will intend to make alterations in time and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatest of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. At this point, the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me. My face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. Okay? Now, couple things here. Daniel doesn't care about the first 3 beasts, which leads me to believe, and again, Acts 17:11, search the scriptures, that he knew who they were. Number one, they were already in existence, okay? This is also why Daniel could so boldly proclaim to Belshazzar 14 years later that you're done. The second beast is taking over, okay? But Daniel wanted to know what the 4th beast was, and it represented. And I think Daniel wanted to know about this beast because he had no clue what it was. Now, I'm going to go way ahead to my notes because I'm getting way ahead of myself here. Okay. Now, this 4th beast, if we are keeping in line with Nebuchadnezzar's dream of Daniel chapter 2, the 4th beast is Rome. But it's not the Roman Empire that we read about in history. Let me get to that in just a second. Because remember what I said, Daniel 1 through 6 sets the stage for Daniel 7 through 12. We have another example of this. Remember, Daniel 2, with Nebuchadnezzar's dream, it was the feet of bronze and clay. Remember that? And the legs and feet of bronze and clay. And we talked about how bronze and clay are incompatible with one another. When they're melted down, they separate and break. Okay. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, Rome collapsed. Well, the western part of the empire collapsed in 476 AD, and the eastern part of the empire collapsed, I think in 14 something, when the Muslims took over Constantinople. How can this be Rome? Well, I don't think it's the empire itself, and this is why I think Daniel was confused. I think it's an ideology. Western ideology, thanks to the Romans and the Greeks, is the most powerful ideology on the planet. And it has basically subdued the planet. Now you can say, well, the Chinese have, 1/3 of the entire population, and they are definitely not Western. That's true, but they are definitely impacted by the West. There is nothing that hasn't been impacted by the West. Nothing, right? It's incredible. And this is due, I teach Western civilization. I mean, heck, Western civilization has its own 2 semesters of class because Greek and Roman thought is so prevalent throughout the planet. Let me point this out. The Greeks wanted everybody to be Greek. This is what's known as Hellenization. Hellene means to be Greek, okay? So, and Alexander, by the way, you have to understand, was educated by Aristotle. So he wasn't an idiot. And what Aristotle told him was, Alexander, you can create an empire, but it's not going to last unless you make sure that the people you conquer think like you. This is where the Persians made their huge mistake. They said, you can do what you want, keep your culture. No, we have to, Aristotle was clear, you have to make them assimilate. The Jews did. All of the cultures that Alexander conquered did. The Romans, even though they conquered the Greeks, thought like Greeks. Heck, Latin was only used as the legal language. Greek was the language of the Roman Empire, the lingua franca. Okay? So, even though the actual Roman Empire at its height was the largest empire geographically the world had ever seen, and continued to be, by the way, until the British Empire of the late 1800s and mid 1800s. Well, late 1700s into the 1800s, right? These 13 little colonies kind of screwed some of that up. Okay? But think of all this. Think of all the facets of culture dominated by Roman and Greek way of life and thinking. Language. The vast majority of our English language comes from Greek and Latin. Okay? Politics. There was a Roman Senate. I mean, it's crazy, right? Philosophy. When we read philosophy, we don't read a lot of Eastern philosophy, do we? We read, even today, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. So much so that the early Christians referred to Moses as the original philosopher, because the Greeks wouldn't have understood what a prophet was, okay? Expansion. Look what the Western European nations did in the 1800s and 1700s, even as far as into the late 1600s, subjugating and taking over South America. What does everyone in South America and Latin America speak today? Spanish, a Western language, which is derived from Greek, right? It's crazy. Well, Portuguese in Brazil, right? So language, expansion. They wanted to colonize and imperialize everything, and they did. We were just talking at the beginning of class of whether English was a language in Kenya. Yeah, thanks to the British taking it over, right? Medicine. Doctors take this thing called the Hippocratic Oath. They don't take the whole thing, because if you read the whole Hippocratic Oath, it actually mentions this little part that they don't say that talks about not giving an abortive remedy to a woman, which just points to the reality that that even existed way back in the days of Hippocrates. But Western medicine, that's how it's always talked about, right? We view Eastern medicine as this weird, like, oh, you're putting pins in people and doing homeopathic stuff, but it's Western medicine. That's what we talk about, right? Technology. Near Eastern countries don't have near the technological advances. We just saw that a few weeks ago when some nuclear sites were destroyed, right? It's just that were built miles underground. Education. The entire education system was built off of the Greek education system. Sexuality, right? Sexuality is not viewed in the Near East as it is in the West. So much so that even today, it's almost worshipped, right? It's become a religion. All of those things we see today have their Western origins with Greeks and Romans. The planet has been dominated by the West after the Reformation, when it established imperial Western nations thirsty for expansion, and they practiced colonization and imperialization on a global scale. Rome may not exist as a single empire, but the West and Western culture dominate the planet today. And by the way, we know by what the scriptures tell us that the Antichrist is going to be a Roman, meaning he's going to be from the West. Okay? We know that. So, thanks to Greek and Roman ideology, some theological historians point to the West's global domination since the 17th century in general, and the United States' global domination in particular since the mid-1900s, as proof of Rome's resurgence, as proof of the Fourth Empire or the Fourth Beast's resurgence. Now, as far as the 10 horns and the horn rising up out of them, we're going to talk about the specifics of what they are in the weeks to come, because what's happening, and this is just a blatant attempt to get you to come back, right? Because Daniel's visions get more and more specific, to the point where in Daniel chapter 9, we know exactly which day Jesus was going to present himself on the triumphal entry as the king of Israel and was rejected. And to the point where there is prophecy after prophecy after prophecy in Daniel chapter 11 that was fulfilled to the T and in chronological order. So we'll get to those in the weeks to come, the last few weeks to come. Now, I think, and again, Acts 17:11, and for those of you who don't know that verse, it just means search the scriptures to see if these things are so. This alarmed Daniel because he couldn't quite put his finger on it. I think there was a recognition that this wasn't just a single empire, it was an ideology. And by the way, just to point out that this is not a pipe dream here. But we need to look at what goes on around us on the planet and say to ourselves, is it getting close? And here's why. Because there are a lot of people in this country, in politics, that want a one-world economy, that want a global, and you've heard this term used, globalism, or a globalist economy. Well, what that is a group of elites running everything else. Well, sounds like the fourth beast here, the ability to crush everything, right? And so it's not far-fetched, because we're already at a point ideologically, because of the way Westerners think. Westerners are greedy, right? Remember, and I can't remember the movie, but Michael Douglas said greed is good. I can't remember what the movie was called. Wall Street, yes. And so it's one of those things where we look at that and go, this is a good thing, right? We want more. And that isn't just money, that also gets to be power. It isn't by accident that Bill Gates, who has more money than he knows what to do with, he's not satisfied with that. Now he wants to tell us what to eat. See, because he's got all the money, so now there's no more significance in trying to achieve more money. So now he wants to tell us that we can't eat beef anymore or whatever. And this is what happens. And so this is where you can see that it doesn't necessarily have to be one political empire or culture or ethnicity per se, but it can be on a global scale, this ideology. And that's exactly what's happening here. And that is why I believe, and again, search scriptures to see if these things are so, why Daniel was so freaked out by all this. Okay? Now, as we go on, next week, he'll begin to get into more details. All right. Sue, you had a question. Oh, in Revelation you're talking about? Okay, the question was for people that listen to this later. How does the sea of believers fit into the mindset. So in Revelation. So my quick answer would be, because you caught me off guard with this question, but my quick answer would be that because it's Jews and it was just the Jewish culture that viewed the sea negatively. I mean, the Israelis have a great navy now, but for the longest, the Jews didn't. The fact that Jonah got on a boat to go all the way to Tarshish shows how angry he was at God. So I think probably what it's referring to there is Gentiles actually being incorporated into the mix. Yeah, and it does seem that way, which is why it's a good question. That frustrates me. Yes.
In verse 24, it says, the court will sit and his power will be taken away. You're talking about the Antichrist, of course, but who's the court?
Well, we'll get to that as well. And the court actually is talked about in Revelation, because the court then becomes the group of, what are they called? The saints? No, what are they called? The elders? Oh gosh, now I got to go to Revelation. It's Revelation 4. The elders, the 24 elders. I'm assuming that that's what it is. The 24 elders. Yes. So Roman, not from a standpoint that he's from Rome or anything, because there have been people that, now this is going to, and this is by no means to offend, but for a while, this goes all the way back to the Reformation. So when and I can't remember, well, Daniel 9 verses 24 through 27 talk about him being a Roman. Now, some took it literally and believe that the Antichrist will be the Pope. And that actually started with, and if anyone's raised Catholic here, that's not what I believe, but that actually started with Martin Luther and John. Martin Luther called the Pope the Antichrist. So he literally believed that the Antichrist, he called him the vicar of Satan. So that actually started with the Reformation, and down through time there have been those that have said that because of some of the things that Roman Catholicism has embraced, like worshiping Mary and the saints, and that becoming idolatrous, that the Pope very well could be the Antichrist, which is weird because we just have an American Pope, and so I don't necessarily believe that's the case. I think from when what it means by him being Roman is that he will be a Westerner. He will be ethnically, culturally, ideologically a Westerner. The thing about the Antichrist, too, that we know for a fact, and I'll bring you guys, I have a list of all the things that he will be. And it's listed, all the biblical references are listed. But he's going to be more in love with himself than anything else. And he's more of an atheist than, like, I'm not going to lie, because the Mormon faith is a polytheistic faith, because they believe that they become gods. This is going to sound really crazy. So, because I'm a big believer in looking at reading the tea leaves around you. When Mitt Romney was running for president, I thought, okay, if he wins, could he be the Antichrist? Because it does talk about him worshiping many gods, but it's more of a symbolic thing than it is anything else, because he just wants everyone to get along with him. But he really isn't. He's really a godless man. So there's some things like that make you wonder. Like people say Trump is the Antichrist. Well, I think after Trump almost getting shot, he's kind of embraced Christ a little bit more than usual. But yeah, we don't know. But he'll be a Westerner. So yeah, when some people take it literally that he's actually a Roman, but based on what we've talked about here tonight, I just think it's from an ideological standpoint more than it is anything else. Janice. Yes, political legals, 100%. Yeah, it's the tentacles of Rome and Greece are in everything. They are. It's crazy, which is why I think the church has to be really, really careful. I mean, we live in a country where we have the right to engage in politics, which I think is pretty cool. So, Romans 13, we do it and we honor our political system. But I think we have to be careful when we mix the sacred with the secular, because I think what ends up happening is the secular usually wins because we have a depraved nature. And I think also that's why the church is at odds with Western political systems so much, because our values are so different than what Western values are. There are a lot of Western values. Yeah, you can have freedom of religion unless it's Christianity, where you can't, where you have to say no to this, and this. You see what I'm saying? You must be tolerant of everything, and we're going to make you be tolerant. Well, that goes against everything we believe sometimes. So, all right, let me pray first. We'll quit. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for the scriptures. Thank you for what they teach us about your divine plan. What a cool thing. We can take hope in knowing that even in all the chaos, whether it's chaos around the church, or it's chaos in America, or it's chaos on a global scale, you are in control. And whereas the first vision is chaos and disorder and evil, the second two visions are your plan coming to fruition. Lord, I pray that we take heart and that we do not grow weary, and we recognize that. We love you, Lord. Amen.